Black Op Radio presents 50 Reasons for 50 Years. Postscript, 1968.
I don't think our loyalty to the country should be measured by our ability to kill. I think our loyalty to the country should be measured by our ability to lead the nation to higher heights of democracy and to the great dream of justice and humanity. In my mind, peace is much more important than faith. And I think there has to be a transformation here in terms of our thinking and in terms of peace. We've got to come to see now that peace must not only be a goal that we talk about and seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal.
It is an underreported fact that Dr. Martin Luther King, one of the most highly respected figures in American history, was under constant surveillance by the FBI and considered an enemy of the state throughout much of his public life, as Judge Joe Brown explained to Black Op Radio.
Prevailing view at that agency at the time was that there is an overweening, over-important thing that merited deviation from constitutional standards, and that was this international communist conspiracy of which Dr. King and other militant or pacifistic civil rights persons were a part of, and that merited a deviation from congressional standards in the American way because of the magnitude of the threat. Well, it turns out that one of the people they targeted for being one of the biggest threats is now possessed of one of the three national holidays for an individual. Most of the country has seen the wisdom of what he was advocating. He has become representative of the country's soul, and the individual that was out to eliminate this so-called threat based on his particular perspective was in fact the bad guy.
Hoover was furious when King won the Nobel Prize. When it came to King and Malcolm X and his whole black civil rights movement, he was determined to try and snip it in the bud. And you could argue that he did.
Dr. King's focus in the last year of his life went beyond the struggle for civil rights to include the Vietnam War, world peace, economic and social justice. David Ratcliffe describes a catalyst for this transition.
There's this extraordinary article in Ramparts magazine called The Children of Vietnam, and it was published originally in January of 1967. They're photographs of children and women primarily. They're pictures that speak worlds about what the U.S. was doing in this part of the world in those years.
Martin wept when he saw the photographs I put in front of him of the maimed children of Vietnam. He had no idea it was that bad. And he said, I can no longer stand aside. I have to come forward. When our government commits this kind of crime, it's being done in our name and with our money. And he was so determined to try to end that war.
There is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience. It strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence. I'm not going to say that all of our problems will be solved if the war in Vietnam is ended, but I do say that the war makes it infinitely more difficult to deal with these problems.
That writing of William Pepper served as the impetus for Martin King to decide to commit himself outright to the purpose of opposing it, which resulted then in the April 4th, 1967 speech at Riverside Church, Beyond Vietnam.
We must continue to raise our voices and our lives if our nation persists in its perverse ways in Vietnam. We are at the moment when our lives must be placed on the line if our nation is to survive its own folly. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
He said that just over 50 years ago. He could be talking right now about just that. King had become a world leader well before 1967 when he gave his speech. He's only treated in the United States as if he was a great civil rights leader, but he went far, far beyond that.
A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift, is approaching spiritual death.
Vociferously, starting on April 4, 1967, with his speech at Riverside Church, came out so strongly against the most violent predators.
And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
His speech at Riverside brought all kinds of hell down upon him. His organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, lost an enormous amount of money and contributions. Virtually every newspaper in the country condemned him editorially, and some even labeled him an actual traitor because he was coming out against his government's waging of this war in Vietnam. He was condemned by civil rights leaders who thought his actions were going to result in the civil rights movement itself losing enormous amounts of money. So they all came down on him in response to pressures from Lyndon Johnson.
How about your relationship with President Johnson? Have you lost favor with Mr. Johnson?
Well, I guess the president would have to answer that question. I have taken a position against the administration's policy, and I would hope the president means what he says when he says that there should always be room for dissent. The important thing is that I not lose favor with truth and with what conscience tells me is right and what conscience tells me is just. I'm much more concerned about keeping favor with these principles than keeping favor with a person who may misunderstand the position I take.
When he publicly chastised the White House, that's when it was essentially King had developed out of being just a civil rights leader and into a major political figure.
He knew that making that speech was going to cause most people in the United States and groups, and certainly the government, to turn away from him and to vilify him. He understood that. He was always committed to risking everything of his life to do what he felt he was being called to do and what he sensed was the right thing to do.
I'm trying to do something, trying to lead us somewhere that will bring an end to what I see as a terrible and a very tragic war, which is damaging the image of our nation here and abroad. And I think the time has come now for our leaders to say that we've made a grave mistake in Vietnam and we ought to take the initiative in bringing an end to this conflict, if not through a unilateral withdrawal, at least through a negotiated settlement. And I think there are things that we can do to create the atmosphere for negotiation.
He had moved well beyond civil rights as a sole mission, but had seen it as a part of a intensive effort to deal with income and asset inequality throughout, not just America, but throughout the world.
There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
He saw the links. He brought together the civil rights movement and the human rights of black and minority people in America with the rights of Asian people who were being slaughtered 10,000 miles away.
These kind of things made King a much more threatening kind of figure to the political establishment.
Now, when you use the word militant, I think it is possible to be militant militant and yet nonviolent. I think I'm militant. Militancy means persistent, to be demanding, to be insistent. And I think it's possible to be militantly nonviolent. And these, I think, are going to be the leaders who will lead us through this very tense period of transition.
That last year, he continued. He never went back. In fact, he was determined to, if need be, to run a third-party campaign against Johnson with Benjamin Spock as his running mate. And that unleashed all the forces of the power structure against him, and he suffered that for the last year of his life.
The Poor People's Campaign, it was estimated at its peak in the fall and early winter of '67 that they were expecting 500,000 people, white and black, to all converge on Washington, D.C.
He was going to bring 500,000 people or more to Washington, not to march, but to encamp in the shadow of the Washington Memorial, visit their elected representatives, and seek to have a reallocation of the assets of America into social programs and away from violent use. Martin felt very strongly he was maligned, he was called a traitor, he was attacked at every level, but he stood firm until he fell.
Stay tuned for the next installment, Postscript 1968.